In this video, I'd like to walk you through the code of a package named Laravel Response Cache. This package can speed up any Laravel application by caching the entire response. Before diving into the code, let's first take a look at this package in action. And we are going to use a fresh Laravel application in which I've already pre-installed the package. So of course, our Laravel application comes with a welcome view, and I'm going to slightly modify that welcome view. After the word Laravel, I'm going to output a random string. So let's see that in the browser. And you can see here that we have that random string. And every time that I refresh the page, I get another string. Now, Laravel Response Cache is implemented as a middleware. Now let's use that middleware on the route. So here I'm going to add middleware cache response. And we see this beautiful error page, and I see that I've made a typo. I forgot an S here. So let's fix that. Cache response. Let's head back, refresh, and we get Laravel with a random number. And if I refresh, the number stays exactly the same because the package has cached the entire response. By caching the response, you can greatly speed up an application. Imagine, for instance, that you needed to execute a couple of queries to build up this page. You wouldn't have to execute any queries at all. But it is handy, for instance, for public pages that have spikes in traffic. Laravel Response Cache will enable my blog to handle bigger surges of traffic. Of course, the package also has ways to clear the cache. So one of the ways is via an artisan command, response cache clear. And if I head back to the browser now and refresh, then we're going to get a new number, but this one is cached now. So if I refresh, I get the same number. If you open up the inspector and go to the network tab and go to the request and make that a little bit bigger. And if I refresh again here, we should see all info. Then you can see that the package sets a header as well. And that header is called Laravel Response Cache, and it contains the date and the time when this response was cached. The package has a lot of other options as well, but I don't want to dive in that now, because I just want to give you a general overview of the code without going into details of every little feature that it has. Now that you know what the package does, let's jump to its code. And let's dive straight to that cache response middleware that we used. Let's scroll down to the handle method. This is the part that will determine if there is something in the cache that we should use. But when a certain request comes in for the first time, this code won't get executed. The first time a request comes in, we're just going to handle it as normal. We are going to pass the request to the next middleware, and the next middleware will do this too. And when all middlewares have been called, the application will run, and that application will return a response. Now, instead of just returning the response, we are going to do something extra. We are first going to take a look if the response cache is enabled, and you can disable this via the config file or via a few other methods, but in normal circumstances it is enabled. Then we are going to take a look if we should cache this response. And this is quite interesting, because by default, we're not going to cache all responses. If we take a look at the response cache config file, you can see here that we have a cache profile. And a cache profile is a class that determines whether the given request should be cached. And this is something that we do in a lot of our packages. If there is a decision that needs to be made, and you want to give the package user some control over how that decision should be made, we often make the decision in a class and make that class configurable in the config file. By default, the package uses this cache profile. Cache all successful GET requests. And I think this class is perfectly named because it will decide that all responses with a successful status code of GET requests should be cached. Let's take a look inside this class. Here you can see that should cache request, after handling a couple of edge cases, will return true if the request is a GET request. And the should cache response will return true if it has a cacheable response code. And one of the cacheable response code is 200, so when it is successful. And this will make sure that we're not caching any binary things. But if it's just text, we will pass over it and we will return true. That is in essence what a cache profile does. A cache profile also extends from a base cache profile. And that base cache profile contains a couple of functions that we don't expect a user to override. But if they want to do so, they have the option. And they can override stuff by just adding that function to their own implementation of the cache profile. So for instance, requests will be cached for a given time frame, and by default we'll just use the value in the config file to determine how long we should cache a request. If for a profile you want to do that in some other way, you can just add that to your own profile. Just imagine that this is a profile of your own here, and just use another implementation here. That's how that works. But let me remove this for now. Let's do one more trip to the base cache profile, because I want to draw your attention to the fact that the base class profile, and thus all cache profiles, that they implement an interface cache profile. If I go to the service provider, you can see that we bind that cache profile interface with an instance of the cache profile class that is used in the config file. So whenever we use cache profile in the constructor of a class and let the container resolve that class, then the configured cache profile will be injected into the class. Then the configured cache profile will be injected into the container. Now that was a serious side trip. Let's go back to the middleware. So we were here, and let's click through should cache. And here you can see that should cache request and should cache response of the cache profile being called. And that cache profile itself, it was injected here into this class. And this class is the response cache class, and it is responsible for coordinating several functionalities. It handles the cache itself. It handles how requests should be hashed, more on that later, and the cache profile itself. Let's head back to our middleware. So we're still in our first request, and we got the response of our application. The response cache is enabled, and if we should cache the response, then we're finally going to cache that response. Let's take a look inside this one. Here we are going to prepare the response a little bit, but I'm not diving into any details of that now. If you want to know more about the replacers, take a look at what I wrote on them in the README file of this package. Let's dive a little bit deeper in that cache response function here. And here you can see that before we store the response into the cache, we'll add a header to it. And this is that extra header that I showed you in the DevTools earlier. And finally, we are going to put the response into the cache. And as a key, we are going to determine a hash for the request. And the contents of what we put into the cache is, of course, the response. And the cache profile will determine how long it should be put in the cache. Okay, let's head back to our middleware. So here we have cached the request. We are going to send out an event that says, hey, we didn't use the cache in this request. And then we are going to return the response, and that response will go to the next middlewares and eventually out to the browser. Okay, remember that we've cached this request. Now imagine that a new request comes in for the same URL. So imagine also that the response cache is enabled. Then we are going to ask the response cache, hey, have you cached this request? So if it is the same request, then the same hash will be calculated and we will decide that we have cached the response. At that point, we are going to fire an event so other parts of the application can hook into that. Then we are going to get the response out of the response cache. We are going to do some preparations. And finally, we are going to immediately return it. And notice that we didn't pass it to next here. So the next middlewares won't be called. And also the application within all your middlewares won't be called again, because we immediately return something here. By skipping all those middlewares and the application itself, the response time of this request will probably be much shorter. And that is how this package works. To close off this video, let's take a look at one of the tests. And let me open integration test here. And this is probably the most important test of the entire package. It proves that the basic caching functionality works. Let's take a look in detail. First, we are going to hit an endpoint with the URL random. And that random route is set up, I think, in the base test case. Let's scroll a little bit up and hunt that down. And sure enough, in the base test case, we have a setup routes function here. And this is probably called a little bit above. So yeah, in the setup method, we call setup routes. And here we somewhere have that random route. And that random route just returns a random string. Let's head back to our test. So we are going to hit that random endpoint and get the response. And we're going to do exactly the same thing for the second time. Let's first discuss this one here, assert same response. So we are going to try to assert that the output in first response and second response is equal. And they can only be equal when the second response was cached, because the route returns random numbers. Now let's take a look at the implementation here of assert same response. And it's very simple. So we are going to assert that the content of the first response is equal to the content of the second response. And this assertion should be true. And if it isn't, we are going to output this string. But in our case, this test will pass. Let me prove that to you by just executing this test. And sure enough, it gives green. Now let's take a look at the assert regular response method and the assert cached response method. Maybe let's start with assert cached response. And this method just tries to assert that the response has that header that we set on a cached response. So that header that you saw in the DevTools of the browser. And assert regular response does more or less the same, but here we are going to let the assertion pass if this condition is false. So when the response doesn't have this particular header. Like I've said previously, the package can do a lot more. If you want to use the package in an application of your own, just read the README, everything is clearly explained. And if you want to know more about the package, just dive into its source code and in the test suite. I think everything is coded up in an understandable way, and there are lots of interesting tidbits to see there.